Hello, and welcome to Our Earth, its climate, history, and processes. My name is David Schultz. In this lecture, we're going to talk about measuring geologic time. If we look at this list of events over the history of the Earth, from its formation 4.5 billion years ago to Darwin's publication on the origin of species just 160 some years ago, we see very specific dates listed for each one of these events. Now, we may not have exact dates for the types of events that we're going to be talking about in this class, and so geologists have found it useful to classify or categorize events into certain geologic eras, eons, periods, and so forth. And so by structuring geologic time in this way, we're able to have a conversation with each other rather than worrying about the specific date, 450 million years ago, for instance, where such dates may not be possible to obtain from the geologic record. So here's the structure of that classification scheme. The largest classification is called the eon. The next largest classification are called eras. Depending on whether you are on the west side of the Atlantic in North America or here in Europe, you may call them periods or systems. Same thing true with the next smaller classification, epochs or series. And then there are even smaller periods that we call stages. And so that's the smallest classification that we have for these geologic periods. Throughout this course, I'm also going to use two abbreviations that are common in geology. Capital M and little a stands for mega annum, that means million years, and GA stands for giga annum, and that represents billion years. Let's start with the largest classification first. These are the eons. There are 4 eons in geologic time. The Hadean, the oldest one, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. So to give you an idea about what happened in each one of these eons, let's start at the oldest one. The Hadean, named after Hades, or the underworld in Greek mythology, represented the period of time when the Earth and Moon were formed. The Earth's surface was molten, and the crust was just starting to form. This period, the Hadean, lasted from the beginning of the Earth's formation to about 3.8 billion years ago. The next eon is called the Archean. This was the base of where we started to see oceans and single-celled fossils, fossil life. The geologic record documents these single-cell fossils and their sedimentary structures that they left behind called stromatolites, and we'll find out more about those in this class. Also, during this period of time, the oxygen concentration was relatively low, and the process of plate tectonics had not really started yet on the planet. The third eon is called the Proterozoic. It started about 2.5 billion years ago and lasted till about 500 million years ago. The Proterozoic was characterized by increasing oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. There are also periods of glaciations, including a period when the Earth may have been entirely covered in ice. And also in the Proterozoic, multicellular life evolved. The fourth and final eon is called the Phanerozoic. It began 542 million years ago and continues to the present. This eon was characterized by increasing complexity of multicellular life, the colonization from the ocean onto the land of plants and animals, and finally, periodic extinction events that almost ended life on Earth as we know it. So those are the 4 eons, the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. And we're going to use these terms throughout the course, so I want you to start getting familiar with them. Now, within the Phanerozoic, we have 3 eras, this being the next smaller classification in geologic time. At the beginning of the Phanerozoic, 542 million years ago, we have the Paleozoic. The Paleozoic lasted until about 250 million years ago when the Mesozoic started. And then finally, the 3rd era is the Cenozoic. This is 65 million years ago. And you may recognize 65 million years ago as the time at which the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, also within the Phanerozoic, we've broken down these eras into periods. The Ediacaran actually existed in the Proterozoic. It represents some of the first evidence for multicellular life, and that's why it is significant. Nevertheless, we have the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, which in North America is broken down into the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, and then finally the Permian. Those periods all belong within the Paleozoic era. The Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous all belong in the Mesozoic era. And finally, the Tertiary and the Quaternary belong in the Cenozoic era. The Tertiary also may be broken down into the Paleogene and Neogene, depending on who you talk to. So these represent the periods within the Phanerozoic, like I said, excluding the Ediacaran, which occurred in the Proterozoic. Now, this is a lot of terminology to remember and making sure that you have it in the right order. So geologists have created a mnemonic to help you remember the order. And so if you look at the first letter of each one of these periods, E, C, O, S, D, C, P, and so on, we put this together into a sentence and use these sentences to remember at least what the first letter is of the period, and then hopefully we remember what the name of the period that goes along with that first letter. So the one we're going to use in this class, and it's quite simple: every camel often sits down carefully, perhaps their joints creak terribly. And then you have to remember the quaternary at the end. You can Google other types of mnemonics that can help you remember these periods within the Phanerozoic. I think this is the simplest one. Now, within the Cenozoic, we also break down these into a further smaller subclassification called epochs. And we won't necessarily talk a lot about the epochs in this class, but in case you come across them in other reading that you're doing, I want you to be familiar with, or at least I've seen this before. So we have the Paleocene, the Eocene, the Oligocene, the Miocene, the Pliocene, the Pleistocene, and the Holocene. Now, the Holocene is the most recent period. We're living in that. Some clever people have proposed that we ought to have a new epoch called the Anthropocene, which is the era that's modified by man and the release of carbon dioxide. We're not going to talk about that here. You may have heard of the Pleistocene before. That represents the last few million years where we've been going through cycles in glacial and interglacial periods. And so geologists have developed a mnemonic that goes along with the camel one previously. Here, the mnemonic is perhaps effective oiling might prolong perfect health. So when you couple these two sets of mnemonics together, you get all the periods and all the epochs in the Cenozoic. So, every camel often sits down carefully, perhaps their joints creak terribly, perhaps effective oiling might prolong perfect health.